I remember the jolt of my heart when I saw the photograph. My wife, wrapped in someone else's arms, smiling a smile I'd never seen on her before. It was a snapshot from a world she never told me existed, a double life hidden behind the routine of our marriage. My hands shook as I held the picture, my mind spinning with questions. Who was she really? I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. This woman I trusted, the partner I once believed I knew better than anyone, had a secret so huge it threatened to upend every moment of our shared existence. And the moment I confronted her with proof, she crumpled like a marionette with its strings cut. I guess I should start with who I am. My name is James and I'd been married to Claire for almost 8 years. We had a little house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind with neat lawns and kids riding bikes after school. On the surface, we lived a typical middle-class life. I worked in IT for a local university, she was a part-time yoga instructor. We went to farmers markets on weekends, caught the occasional movie, and spent Sunday afternoons visiting her mother or mine for a home-cooked meal. I believed we were content, or at least comfortably settled in the normal rhythms of a long-term relationship. Still, over the past year, Claire began acting distant. Nothing blatant at first, just small changes in her routine. She took on extra yoga sessions at odd hours, started disappearing for entire afternoons, claiming she needed me time. Her phone buzzed more often and she'd hush it quickly, dismissing my questions with a forced smile. I tried telling myself it was stress, that maybe she was exploring new hobbies or wanting more independence. Yet a nagging suspicion grew. One evening, I spotted a second phone in her gym bag, partially hidden beneath a folded towel. When I asked about it, she brushed it off, saying it belonged to a friend. My gut churned with doubt, but I didn't push. I'd never been the paranoid type and I despised the idea of snooping. However, as the weeks passed, her excuses got flimsier. She'd vanish late at night, returning with vague explanations about meeting a yoga client who needed personal advice. Even if that were true, something felt off. The tension in her voice, the emptiness in her eyes whenever I tried to get close. Eventually, I confided in my friend Mark, a co-worker who'd been through a rough divorce. He told me gently that if my instincts were screaming, I should probably listen. That conversation nudged me over the edge. I decided to look deeper, though part of me felt dirty for violating her privacy. But I had no idea how else to get answers. My heart still hoped she was simply restless or bored, not lying about a second life. The day I found proof arrived on a random Tuesday morning. She'd left for her usual yoga shift. My remote work day was slow, so I rummaged through the closet for an old laptop charger. While searching a box of miscellaneous cords, I discovered a small envelope pressed flat under some old scarves. Curious, I opened it, and froze. Inside lay photographs of Claire with another man, taken in some city I didn't recognize. The timestamps were from months ago. In one, she laughed at him in a stylish cafe, her hand resting intimately on his shoulder. In another, they posed in front of a fountain, arms intertwined. My stomach dropped. This wasn't a fleeting fling, judging by how comfortable they seemed. It looked like they belonged to each other. My mind reeled. She never said she traveled recently, at least not overnight, so how did she end up in these places? My heart thundered, fueling anger and betrayal. Yet the shock overshadowed everything else. How long had she hidden this? Then, in the envelope, I found an ID badge with her photo but a different name, Samantha Cole. She wore heavier makeup in the picture, a polished outfit. Who was Samantha Cole? Trying not to panic, I took photos of these items on my phone, then returned them to the envelope and replaced it beneath the scarves. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped them. She had a whole identity outside our marriage. My mind leapt to 100 scenarios. Was she part of some con? An affair that required an alias? Or had she built an entirely separate life in another city? My mouth went dry at the enormity of the possibility. That afternoon, I paced the living room, waiting for her to return. When she finally walked in, hair slightly damp from a shower, she flashed me a quick smile. I pretended nothing was wrong, heart pounding. "Busy day?" she asked, tossing her keys on the counter. I forced a nod, swallowing my terror. I decided to bide my time, gather more clues before confronting her. Part of me dreaded the moment it would all come out, certain it would destroy whatever was left of our marriage. Another part demanded the truth now, no matter the cost. Over the next week, I followed her discreetly on a couple of occasions. It felt surreal, me in my old sedan tailing the car I once trusted to ferry groceries. One Thursday, she left midday, claiming she had a private yoga session in a neighboring town. Instead, she drove nearly an hour away, parked by a small office building, and entered a suite labeled Glendale Consulting. I waited, nerves on edge, for nearly 2 hours until she emerged, chatting with someone on her phone. She wore business casual clothes she'd never shown me, carrying a sleek briefcase. No yoga mat, no mention of a client needing spiritual wellness. My blood ran cold. She'd changed identities, perhaps literally. That night, I lay awake, staring at her sleeping form, mind spinning with questions. Was she working for Glendale Consulting under the name Samantha Cole? Did she have a second job, a second life that she concealed from me? Why keep it secret? My heart ached, knowing this was beyond a simple affair. She was living a double life, bridging two worlds with alarming ease. I felt foolish for not noticing all the signs sooner. Finally, I decided I couldn't keep silent. The next evening, once she got home, I confronted her in the kitchen. I pulled out my phone, showing her the photos I took of the ID badge, the pictures with the unknown man. Her face went pale, eyes widening in panic. She stammered, "Where? How did you find that?" Her voice trembled with raw alarm. I demanded an explanation. She sputtered excuses, half-lies, trying to spin it as a misunderstanding. I pressed harder, reminding her I followed her to Glendale Consulting. Her composure cracked. I saw fear in her eyes, not just guilt. Something bigger weighed on her. Eventually, under my relentless questioning, she confessed. She'd built an alternate persona, Samantha Cole, for reasons she struggled to articulate. Something about needing an escape from the mundane routine of our marriage, a thirst for excitement, and the thrill of living on the edge. She admitted she'd met a man, Ethan, through that second identity. He believed her name was Samantha. They'd traveled to different cities, attending conferences or business meetups under that false pretense. She was Samantha part of the time, Claire the rest. She swallowed, tears streaming as she revealed how deeply she was in over her head. She had debts, secrets, shady deals made under her alias. She said she never intended to ruin us, that it started small, pretending to be someone else online, then it spiraled into real-life meetups. She sank to her knees, sobbing that she didn't know how to stop it. I stood there, shell-shocked, the woman I thought I knew unraveling before my eyes. An affair was one thing. Living an entire second life, forging a new name and job, was beyond my comprehension. Anger and sorrow warred inside me. I asked about the man in the photos. Her tears intensified. "He thinks I'm single. He thinks I'm some marketing consultant," she admitted. "He has no clue about you, about who I really am." It was all a lie. I wanted to feel alive. My mouth felt dry. The betrayal was deeper than I imagined. She wasn't just cheating, she'd systematically deceived me, him, and who knew how many others. At that point, I demanded she leave. My heart thundered, my voice cracking with anger. She tried to cling to me, apologizing, but I brushed her off. "If you can lie about your entire identity," I said, voice trembling, "who are you?" She collapsed right there in the hallway, sobbing uncontrollably as if her world had caved in. And in a way it had, her carefully spun illusions shattered. I stared down at her, tears burning my eyes. The woman I loved was a stranger, her life a carefully woven tapestry of falsehoods. Every vow she spoke on our wedding day felt like a lie now. She begged me to let her explain more, to give her a chance to fix it. I told her it was too late, the damage was done. The stark evidence of her double life felt too massive to overcome with mere words. She got up, trembling, and grabbed some belongings. The last thing she said before she left was, "I never meant to hurt you this badly. I got lost in what I thought I wanted to be." Then she disappeared into the night, leaving me with a swirl of fury, heartbreak, and a lingering sense of pity for how broken she looked. That night, I found no solace in our bed, so I ended up slumped on the couch, staring at the dark ceiling, tears sliding unchecked down my face. All those nights I thought she was at yoga workshops or out with friends, she was living as Samantha Cole, forging a life with another man, forging a persona that made her feel powerful or free. Everything we shared was overshadowed by her elaborate deceit. The rage roiled, but so did a strange sadness. She must have been deeply unhappy or lost to do something so drastic. I tried to reconcile the sweet wife I once knew with this manipulative figure. Neither image felt real anymore. For a few days, I functioned in a numb state, going to work, returning to an empty house, mentally replaying her confessions. My phone remained silent. She vanished entirely, maybe too ashamed to face me or too busy spinning a new story for the man who believed her name was Samantha. I confided in my coworker Mark, who listened in astonishment, reminding me none of this was my fault. He suggested I lawyer up. Maybe her double life risked financial entanglements I wasn't aware of. The prospect made my stomach lurch. I dreaded discovering hidden debts or fraudulent actions done in my name. Yet part of me feared the worst. Only a week later did I realize the full extent of her meltdown. I got a frantic call from a mutual acquaintance who said my wife, ex-wife? I wasn't even sure how to label her, had shown up at the hospital, collapsed in a panic attack, screaming incoherently about everything unraveling. She apparently gave my name as her emergency contact. My heart pounded as I drove to the hospital, torn between concern and the fresh pain of betrayal. When I arrived, I discovered she'd been sedated, the doctors explaining that stress-induced anxiety and possible substance use triggered her collapse. She was stable though. For a brief moment I felt sorry for her. She'd reaped what she sowed, but a part of me remembered the woman who once fell asleep in my arms, cherishing our simplest of nights. I sat by her hospital bed, tense, waiting for her to wake. My mind raced with questions. Did the man in her double life discover her real identity? Did their scheme blow up? Was she forced to confront the truth about her deception? The nurse told me she'd likely be groggy for hours. I almost left, but something made me stay, maybe the final vestige of love or at least empathy for the broken soul she'd become. Eventually, her eyes fluttered open. She saw me, tears brimming immediately. "Jake," she murmured, voice rasping. "I'm sorry." I nodded stiffly. I wanted to rage at her, but her face looked so frail, the edges of her eyes lined with desperation. She tried to speak, words tumbling out. Everything fell apart. He realized I was lying, threatened to expose me. I panicked, my identities colliding, I couldn't breathe. "I ended up here," she sobbed, clinging to my hand. I let her, too stunned to protest. She explained how the other man, Ethan, discovered her real name, realized she was married, uncovered that she'd not only lied to him but might have used his funds to maintain illusions. Furious, he'd kicked her out, threatened legal action if she tarnished his reputation. She found herself homeless, no single identity to fall back on, no stable job since she'd been living half as Samantha, half as Claire. The mental strain broke her down until she collapsed. My chest ached with a strange mix of pity and betrayal. I told her I wasn't sure what she expected from me. "We're done," I reminded her, tears creeping into my own voice. "You tore apart our life for a fantasy. Now you're suffering the consequences." She nodded, weeping quietly. "I know," she whispered. You're the only stable thing I ever had," ironically. I hate what I've done. Please don't leave me like this." The rawness in her plea cut deep. But how could I trust her after discovering she systematically lied to me for who knows how long? The doctor came in, ending our tense conversation. Later, I found out from the hospital staff that she listed me as next of kin for discharge. If I refused, she might end up in a halfway house or on the streets. My moral conscience twisted in knots. She'd shattered my heart, but letting her wander out with nowhere to go felt cruel. Ultimately, I arranged for her to stay at a mental health facility for a short-term crisis program, bridging the gap until she could figure out her next step. I wasn't welcoming her back home, but I couldn't watch her self-destruct without offering some humane help. That's the moment I realized how complicated love can be. She had hurt me beyond measure, yet I couldn't find it in myself to watch her sink. I told her plainly, "I'll help you get on your feet, but we're not rebuilding our marriage. That trust is gone." She cried, nodded, accepting my boundary. Over the next weeks, I visited her occasionally, each meeting a labyrinth of awkwardness. She was fragile, apologizing constantly, explaining how emptiness and dissatisfaction led her to create a double life. She insisted the affair was partly emotional, partly about feeling alive. She claimed she always cared for me, but her own demons overshadowed that care. I listened in numb silence, not sure if I believed her. Regardless, she was paying the price. A broken mind, a collapsed identity, no illusions left to hide behind. Eventually, she found a place in a group home that helped people struggling with mental health and financial instability. She started therapy, tried to piece her real self back together. I, meanwhile, moved forward with my own life, free from the suffocating anxiety of her secrets. We parted ways without the venom that might have defined us had she not collapsed and revealed the depth of her anguish. I can't say we parted as friends. We parted as two battered individuals who once shared a life but now needed separate paths to heal. In the end, I see it all as a cautionary tale. My wife's double life sprang from dissatisfaction and the thrill of living on the edge. She built a false persona, found a new lover, and lost herself in the process. When I exposed her, that house of cards came crashing down, leaving her a broken figure in a hospital bed. It was tragic, but it was also the only outcome for someone who believed she could juggle multiple identities without consequence. For me, it was a baptism by fire, learning the limits of trust and the resilience of my own heart. I don't regret offering her some measure of help. Perhaps that was my final act of love, or maybe just my own moral code. Either way, I walk away knowing I faced her betrayal without losing my compassion. And in a world where illusions so easily reign, perhaps that's a victory all its own. I spent the next couple of hours pacing the hospital's waiting area, replaying every conversation I'd had with her in the last few months. My anger kept spiking, thinking about the lies she'd told, the secret identity she'd hidden beneath the surface of our life. Yet another part of me, a frustrated, weary part, felt only pity. Seeing her collapse, face drained of color, eyes wild with panic, reminded me that however deep her betrayal ran, something inside her was broken too. A nurse eventually emerged, explaining that she was stable but needed rest. I hovered in the corridor, wrestling with the question of whether I should be the one by her bedside. On one hand, I was her spouse, or at least I had been until everything unraveled. On the other, she'd lied about practically everything: her job, her finances, even her name for the other man. Did she still deserve my presence now that her facade had literally collapsed at my feet? I ended up finding a chair in a cramped corner, arms folded against my chest, fighting the urge to walk away. But I couldn't bring myself to leave. Anger simmered just below the surface, but I wasn't cruel enough to vanish while she was in such a fragile state. After what felt like an eternity, a doctor approached, telling me she was awake, though groggy, and asking if I wanted to see her. My stomach nodded. The last time we spoke, I'd confronted her with her double life, demanded she leave. Now she was lying in a hospital bed, likely struggling to keep her carefully constructed illusions from swallowing her whole. The hallway to her room smelled of antiseptic and fresh paint. My pulse hammered in my ears as I nudged the door open. She sat propped against a pillow, and four in her arm, her usually vibrant face pale and weary. A nurse stood at the foot of the bed, checking her vitals. The moment she spotted me, her eyes flickered with a swirl of emotions: relief, shame, fear. I lingered near the threshold, not sure how to approach. "You came," she rasped. Her voice carried a frail disbelief, as if she'd half expected me to abandon her at the hospital doors. I shrugged, arms still crossed. "Couldn't just leave you like this," I muttered. "How are you feeling?" It was a stupid question. Obviously she wasn't feeling great, but I had no script for this scenario. She swallowed, glancing at the nurse, who quietly stepped out. The door clicked shut, leaving us alone in that sterile room. For a moment we just stared at each other, the tension so thick I could almost taste it. Finally she let out a shaky exhale. "I know I have no right to ask for your concern. But I'm scared," she admitted, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. Everything's spinning out of control. I've lost track of who I really am. I wanted to say something scathing, like "you should have thought of that before lying to me," but the sight of her tethered to hospital tubes quieted some of my fury. "Why'd you do it?" I asked instead, voice hoarse. "Was it not enough being who you were? Why construct this entire second life, string me along, and then, I don't know, hide it all behind a facade?" She squeezed her eyes shut, a tear sliding down her cheek. "I don't even know where to begin. It started small, just me feeling trapped, bored, wanting to explore other aspects of myself. Then I met someone who believed I was Samantha Cole, and it felt exhilarating to be this different persona, free from expectations. I told myself it was harmless, that I'd keep it separate. But it spiraled. He fell for Samantha, offered me a chance at new experiences, and I got addicted to that rush. Meanwhile, I was lying to you each day, telling you I was teaching yoga or out with friends. The guilt built, but so did the thrill." Her voice broke. "I never meant to destroy us. I guess I convinced myself I could keep both worlds afloat, but it's impossible. Lies catch up to you, and once you confronted me, I realized how flimsy it all was." She lifted her hands, trembling in her lap. "Then everything with him fell apart. He realized the money I said I had was non-existent. He found out I was married. He threatened to blackmail me if I made a scene. I panicked, collapsed. It was just too much. I'm so sorry." I stood there, anger and pity swirling in a toxic mix. Seeing her this vulnerable, hearing the raw fear in her voice, tugged at the part of me that once loved her deeply. Yet the memory of her betrayal stung fiercely. "I can't wave a wand and pretend none of this happened," I said quietly. "I'm still trying to wrap my head around the fact that you lived a double life, like some spy novel. And all I got was the aftermath." She nodded, tears dripping onto the sheet. "I understand," she whispered. "I don't expect you to forgive me overnight or maybe ever. But I needed you to know the truth. I wasn't trying to demean you or say our life was worthless. I just felt stifled, I guess, and I made all the wrong choices chasing an escape." I sank into the plastic chair by her bed, exhaustion seeping into my bones. "What now?" I asked. "You told me you were done with Samantha Cole, that you cut ties with him. Are there consequences? Legal issues? Debt?" She nodded miserably. "I'm not sure. He used me for some shady deals. I might be liable. I'm hoping the meltdown I had might open a door to some medical leave or therapy. My boss at the yoga studio says I can come back, but I might need more stable income." She licked her lips, eyes flicking to me. "I know it's unfair to ask, but would you at least help me figure out my finances? You're good with that kind of thing." She gave a hollow laugh. "Ironic, I know, given how I lied about everything." My chest tightened. She was right, it was ironic. Once I'd have gladly helped my wife with any financial problem, but now I barely recognized her. And yet, the empathetic part of me couldn't turn away from a drowning person. "I'll think about it," I said stiffly. "First, focus on getting better. You collapsed from stress or worse. Let's see what the doctors say." She nodded, tears still glistening. "Thank you," she whispered, voice cracking. "I don't deserve your kindness, but I'm so grateful you're here." I couldn't muster a response. Part of me wanted to walk out, but another part stayed put in that uncomfortable chair, silent testimony that I was at least not as cruel as the illusions she'd conjured. Eventually, the nurse came back, asking me to step out so they could check her vitals. I lingered in the hallway again, mind buzzing with the madness of it all. My wife, someone I believed was maybe bored or restless, had secretly lived as a different person in a different relationship. Now that double life was laid bare, and she lay in a hospital bed, unraveling. Something in me felt a painful sense of vindication. She wanted more excitement, more freedom, and ended up losing both. But I also recognized the raw sadness in that. Maybe we were both victims of her illusions. Over the next few days, I juggled work and sporadic hospital visits. She gradually recovered physically, but the emotional toll was evident. My anger hadn't disappeared. Some days I snapped at her, demanded more details about how she juggled her two worlds. She told me about the fabricated business conferences, the secret second phone, the carefully timed texts. It was horrifying to realize how meticulously she'd planned the deceit, but also tragic to see how she believed it was the only way to feel alive. Sometimes I asked myself why I still cared. The rational voice inside me said I should sign divorce papers, cut ties, let her face the music. Yet I felt compelled to at least guide her to a path of honesty. If nothing else, I wanted closure, to know she understood how deeply she'd hurt me. Maybe I wanted to ensure she'd never do this to anyone else. Or maybe I was just a fool who couldn't abandon someone in crisis. Emotions rarely follow logic. When she was discharged, she faced the bleak reality of returning to an apartment we once shared, now stripped of trust. I let her stay for a few days, but insisted on sleeping in the spare room. I wasn't ready to pretend we were normal. She spent hours calling banks, trying to undo the damage caused by her other persona. I offered minimal guidance, explaining how to flag suspicious accounts, how to alert the credit bureaus. She wept often, apologizing every time she looked at me. The tension was unbearable. Finally, I laid down ground rules. "I'll help you straighten out your finances. But we can't just slip back into marriage like nothing happened. You have a lot of therapy to do, a lot of trust to rebuild, if that's even possible. And if you can't respect that boundary, you need to find somewhere else to stay." She nodded, tears tracking her cheeks. "I understand," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I keep saying it, but I know it's not enough." We settled into a strange routine, separate bedrooms, shared tension. She'd wake early for therapy sessions the hospital recommended. I'd sip my coffee, half ignoring her. In the evenings, we sometimes talked about the next financial steps, closing the accounts her alias used, drafting letters to potential creditors explaining she'd been manipulated. Slowly, a kind of uneasy cooperation formed, overshadowed by the knowledge that once she was stable, she might leave for good. Or maybe I'd ask her to. I had no illusions that a quick fix existed for such a massive betrayal. One weekend, I accompanied her to see a lawyer specializing in identity theft cases. She recounted the double life, tears brimming as she explained how it spiraled out of her control. The lawyer gave her a mixture of legal advice and condemnation, telling her she was lucky no criminal charges were filed against her. After the appointment, we sat in the car and she whispered, "I ruined everything. I don't expect you to love me after this." My heart throbbed. "I can't love a lie," I said softly. "But I'm not heartless. I see you're broken and part of me wants you to heal. That doesn't mean we can go back. There's too much damage." She nodded, silent tears marking her face. In that moment, I felt a pang of the old affection we once shared, but it was overshadowed by the gravity of her deception. Some things might be too shattered to rebuild. As time passed, we found a measure of civility. She moved to a small rental apartment once she saved enough from her returning yoga clients. We parted ways calmly, neither of us sure if it was a permanent farewell or just a step in the messy journey. My wounds were still raw, trust broken. She needed to figure out who she was without the illusions of Samantha Cole or the comfort of my love. Occasionally, she'd text me updates about her therapy, thanking me for not throwing her to the wolves. I'd respond politely, but I kept my emotional distance. Eventually, I realized I was free from the crushing weight of her secrets. She might remain in my life's periphery, an echo of what used to be, but I refused to let her define my future. I sought counseling on my own, learning to process betrayal without burying myself in bitterness. Through it all, I found a strange sense of empathy, for her, yes, but mostly for the flawed human condition. She collapsed under the lie she lived, and though it hurt me deeply, it also revealed she was more lost than malicious. A few months later, a mutual acquaintance mentioned she'd joined a support group for people who'd lived double lives or engaged in compulsive lying. I felt a pang of relief, hoping that meant she was truly seeking honesty. As for me, I moved forward. I dated casually, found moments of genuine laughter with new friends, embraced a sense of self-determination that came from surviving a betrayal of this scale. If there's any conclusion, it's that we both learned illusions can't stand forever. She discovered that living two identities eventually leads to collapse, physically and emotionally. I discovered that heartbreak can coexist with a measure of compassion, but that doesn't mean forgetting the damage done. We parted not as enemies, not as lovers, but as two people who once shared a life, forced to confront the fragility of trust. She collapsed the moment I exposed her deception, and in that collapse she perhaps found the seed of genuine self-examination. Whether that seed grows into real change is her journey now. I stand at last on steadier ground. The nights aren't haunted by doubts or the swirl of unasked questions. I wake each morning, aware that I faced a darkness I never anticipated, my wife living a double life, and emerged with my integrity intact. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I recall the day she crumpled to the floor, illusions shattered at her feet, and realize that was also the day I reclaimed my right to a life free of secrets and lies. In that sense, maybe we both were set free even if the path to freedom was paved with heartbreak.